Friends, Romans, colleagues, buddies, pals. I had a plan. I had a schedule. I realised that an unordered list on a post-it note doesn't look like a schedule, but nonetheless, there was order, there was a system, there was a lot on. My workroom currently looks like the final round on a game of Carcassonne. That's not finished. That's not finished. That's not finished. That's not finished. What even is happening with this? I'm actually not sure what I was thinking. God, that's not even started. But then this happened. And now I have to make a sideless surcoat. Who needs plans? I started out by taking some basic measurements. I wouldn't pay too much attention to this step for reasons that will become extremely obvious in about 60 seconds time. I transferred those measurements to some scrap fabric and created roughly the bodice shape I thought I would need. I even did some lovely aesthetic shots from different angles. Look at me go. Because this scrap fabric wasn't big enough to make the garment as one, I had to piece in the skirt of the surcoat. I used the offcuts to create gores at the sides of the skirt by flipping them upside down and around, only I really shouldn't have bothered because I then tried on the mock-up version and it was hilariously wrong. So we started over again. Better, less aesthetic. This time I used some brown linen that was left over from my Game of Thrones dress. I cut the skirts a lot more width so they'd fit around my hips, a little bit of a train. You can't make a historical costume for an elite woman and not have a train, that's basically illegal. We did gauze again, and then because the fabric was a little short I pieced in a yoke so there was actually something going over my shoulders. I used the original mock-up as a kind of guide, but there was a lot of improvisation here still. Not perfect, but better. I can work with this. The first thing I wanted to establish was the fur. I had a scrap of fake fur in my stash, so I traced around the armholes, Sharpie directly onto the back of fake fur like no one's watching, Ash, and then used the very scientific method of about like that to make a couple of adjustments, then used a pack of sewing machine needles to figure out the width I wanted. By the way, I use a scalpel to cut fake fur. I find it's the best way of not getting a huge amount of fake fur shedding everywhere, just a manageable amount of fake fur shedding everywhere. I used the piece I just created as a template to trace 3 more, so I had both sides front and back. I also decided I wanted the fake fur bib that some sideless surcoats had, so I did a similar process of tracing, except this time I was making it smaller by approximately the width of a needle packet so it wouldn't overlap too much with the side bands. I then thread marked where the bib reached to, which was important for the next step of fancy fabric placement. Inspired by the vertical patchwork of Utica's sideless surcoat, I pulled a bunch of yellowish pieces of silk, mostly single orphaned panels from kimono that I've had lurking in my stash for years. For the front I wanted a nice centered panel as the focal point, so the 2 pieces of fabric I attached either side were much too wide. I just flipped the whole thing over and trimmed them down. For the back I sewed 2 lengths side by side, then lined up the centre back of the surcoat with the centre seam, before trimming the excess. Then it was time for gauze. When I cut the original gauze I made the front and back match, but I wasn't happy with the dramatic shelf into the train, so the front gauze are exact copies and the back has more of a curve at the hem. I used some of the offcuts and an extra piece of silk I hadn't touched yet, so we'd have a kind of patchwork thing going on. I tacked down the edges of the silk outer I hadn't already partially attached to the seam allowance of the linen layer, and then... Sir, excuse me. You can't park here. I laid the gauze down where they were going to go, and this is when I realised that instead of making this patchwork I had managed to put 3 pieces of the same fabric all on the same side. Oh well. I turned the edges under and pressed them with an iron, and this is when I realised that you shouldn't iron over that gold paint without a pressing cloth. Luckily I didn't do too much damage to either the fabric or the iron, but the whole project was extremely aromatic for a couple hours. But I had extended the train out to either side, which meant there was now a section with no linen lining that I needed to piece in, and it was about this time I had to accept that my sewing machine was having an entire moment, and just did it by hand. Top tip, if you're ever thinking to yourself, it's fine, I'll just buy the super cheap sewing machine needles off Amazon because they're on Prime, it's not fine, don't do that to yourself. Okay, so let's talk about the history of the Sideless Surcoat a little bit. Starting with the name. Sideless Surcoat seems to be fairly widespread, but there are a lot of costumers and reenactors who refer to the specific style of garment I'm recreating as the Gates of Hell, citing censorious preachers of the period. I can't exactly find an actual historical source for that. I haven't done nearly enough research to say conclusively one way or another, and I don't think I could without learning Middle English, which is not going to happen. But the only period reference I could easily find that even seemed to slightly resemble the phrase is a line in the Canterbury Tales, which refers to a woman wearing scarlet gates. I've seen A Knight's Tale enough times to know that Chaucer is beyond reproach as a source. But more seriously, unless someone can pull an actual source for the term, Gates of Hell might not have a contemporary basis for describing this garment, but it is very handy as a term to distinguish regular old Sideless surcoats worn by pretty much everyone over the course of about 200 years, from the specifically late medieval super fancy fur-trimmed moment. The Sideless surcoat more generally shows up as early as the 12th century and as late as the mid-15th in Europe. The surviving examples I've seen all seem to be from Spain, except for potentially one from Herjolfsnes in Greenland, but this doesn't actually mean all that much. There is so little surviving medieval clothing that, as costumers, we mostly have to look at other sources. And there are lots and lots of surcoats in medieval manuscript illustrations, statues, funerary brasses. We have lots of pictures, is what I'm getting at. Great for general details, bad for construction information. We can tell that the very exaggerated Sideless surcoat, or Gates of Hell, especially with the fur as I've chosen to do, comes from the very end of the period when it was popular, somewhere in the late 1300s through to the mid 1400s, and was by this time very much a high status and ceremonial garment. Basically, you'd be dressed in one if you were a royal at an important event, a wealthy bride, or the allegorical depiction of something, not some random peasant. There is one thing that's confusing me a little bit, and it's these decorations that look a little bit like buttons down the front of some of them. They're not buttons. Buttons of this period were really very small. I'm not entirely sure what you'd call them. If this was 200 years later, they'd be called ouches or ouches, unclear on the pronunciation, but it's a fun word. And I've seen one reference to the term bezants, which is also a fun word, but as it is, I'm just going to call them decorative things. I've seen several people say they must be attached to a band to make them removable in some way for cleaning, but I don't see bands in most of the images, and cleaning what? You're not washing these garments. They're on the outside of several layers and they don't need laundering. They wouldn't survive it anyway if they're made from metallic brocades like some of the surviving examples are, and you just don't wash fur. Getting fur really wet is a bad idea, and I don't think they would interfere too much with brushing it out. I guess you might need to clean the metal if it gets tarnished, but if they're expensive and made of gold, which doesn't tarnish, I just wish people would be a bit more specific about what they mean when they say things like removable for cleaning. Anyway, I'm not going to worry about it too much because I'm not making an accurate historical reconstruction. I think it's going to look better if I attach my decorations individually and don't stress about making them too removable. I do think if you wanted to make a historical Sideless surcoat for a reenactment or something, you might want to look into that in some more detail, rather than just taking it as read that there's a removable band that isn't shown in any of the pictures, because I don't know, something about that's not adding up for me. In the end, the reference I ended up following most closely were the statues of Jean de Bourbon and Jean de Armagnac, who might actually be Isabeau of Bavaria, but I'm ignoring that because her name isn't a biscuit, which in the reference I found were dated as 1388. Unfortunately, I don't think I can show the images on screen because of copyright, but I'll link in the description box below. Again, I really want to stress that this was a random project made out of scrap fabrics inspired by a drag queen, not a historical reconstruction, but having a specific reference is still pretty helpful. Remember the fur? We're going back to the fur. I traced off the side guards onto Amazon packing paper ironed flat because I'm cheap and don't have any proper pattern paper. I'm going to use this pattern to make facings out of some random gold satin I had lying around, so the inside of the side cutouts looks pretty. Then, in a very welcome twist of fate, my new sewing machine needles arrived. I put one in, choirs of angels sang, there was a dramatic lens flare, and now there will be a beautiful montage of me assembling the side guards in fur and satin, during which the thread does not break even once. Basically just a magical experience. Oh, top tip though, I use a zigzag stitch when seaming fur together. It makes it easier to comb the pile out of and thus the join is more invisible. So at this point I went to fit the guards onto the surcoat and discovered a slight issue at the back of the neck. No worries, trace that, make a fur collar, stitch it on, realise it's too small, piece a scrap of fur in to cover the gap, hope nobody notices. Okay, actually attaching the guards now. I used a combination of pins and these wonder clips that everyone raves about and I've literally never used except in this moment because they're basically garbage for anything that isn't a couple of really specific uses. Like, if you nudge them, they just move out of place. They're not a replacement for pins. Stop telling people they're a replacement for pins. Anyway, with that done, I then fed the whole thing through the machine again, which, yeah, I'm still not over how it's just beasting through 8 layers of fake fur and linen and silk at a time, but seriously, buy decent needles, life is too short. And here's me hand sewing down the inside facings that I told you about but never really showed you before now because I'm a bad YouTuber, but I couldn't figure out how to press them with the fur in place, so I guess they're just bubbly and hideous, and honestly I don't care, they're on the inside. The only thing left to do was the hem, which I decided was too thick and unwieldy to turn inwards. Instead I'm cutting 2-inch strips of bias binding from one of the silk scraps, yes that's a Sharpie and no, the marks have not come off my floor, to do a nice neat finish, which I didn't film because I was sat watching Netflix and I didn't want you to judge me. That Winx Saga thing is a really bad, but also kind of hits the spot, you know? Okay, I said the only thing left to do, but actually I still had to figure out these decorative thingies on the front. I knew I could buy something that looked about right, like for example these ooches from the Tudor tailor, but they were going to cost me something like £100 for a project that had so far cost me nothing except a pack of sewing machine needles and lots of my worthless time. So it's a generally used phrase that if all you have is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. And thus it follows that when what you have is a 3D printer, so I knocked something up in Tinkercad and this is the final design I ended up with. I did a test print to check a few things, was pretty happy with it, but the loops were too fragile and it was a little on the small side. A couple of tweaks and I was ready to do test print number 2, which I was much happier with. I printed a couple of batches, primed them with a black base coat because the silver paint I used doesn't like sticking to plastic, and then filled in the central gemstones with UV resin. This process in total honestly doubled the length of time I spent working on this project, but it was still much quicker and cheaper than the alternative. Medieval's nice and all, but sometimes 21st century solutions to problems are just a lot more not involving learning metal casting or how to make enamel. In the end I painted about 15 of these decorative thingies and I only sewed on about 10 because I spaced them 1.5 inches apart. I think that's too far, I'm not super happy with it, so I think I'll rip them off and redo it, but it was good enough for the reveal photo shoot. This is one of those historical garments that just looks so weird and unflattering to modern eyes that I think it actually comes out the other side and is kind of amazing. It's really comfortable to wear, I wasn't too hot or too cold. Also, for an elite garment, I found it surprisingly practical to get chores done. Well, that was an adventure. I'm really happy with the project overall, particularly the decorative thingies. I've managed to get the file uploaded to Thingiverse, so if you have a 3D printer of your own and you want to give it a go, you can follow the link in my description box. You'll also find a link there to my Ko-fi page, so if you enjoyed this video, or if you like the 3D print and want to give the best thank you a creator can receive, cold hard cash, you can make a donation there to support the channel. If you do print some, tag me on Instagram. I'm on Instagram now at AshLG Costumes, because it was time I sat down and started behaving like a real adult. Also, when printing, I had some adhesion issues, so I have a couple of seconds decorative thingies that came out kind of wobbly and asymmetrical. I figured someone might like them, so I'm giving them away. Details on the Instagram. Head over and check that out. Look at me, I sound like I know what I'm doing. Every year I sit down and think, that season wasn't amazing. Maybe I won't watch Drag Race next year. Then January rolls around and all of a sudden I have all of the opinions. Opinions like Denali was robbed. I guess, where else are you getting a show about all my favourite things? Fashion, sewing, makeup, music, dance, comedy, and queer culture. And how many other shows are there with an almost entirely queer cast that are overwhelmingly positive and not about the AIDS crisis? Anyway, I don't mostly regret dropping everything for several weeks just to do a random garment. It was a lot of work and that I have no purpose or plan for, but thankfully nobody else on season 13 has done a historically inspired outfit, so it's not going to happen again. Was the script that I wrote before this happened.